Experience the global phenomenon in the variety special pre-recorded Taylor Swift The Eras Tour, The Final Show, and the documentary nonfiction series Taylor Swift, The End of an Era. The Telegraph lauds it as a dazzling, revealing, and emotional look behind the all-conquering entertainer of our times. Stream the concert film and get a behind-the-scenes look at the history-making tour in the docuseries now on Disney+. On this episode, I talked to the makers of 3 projects: Sean Combs' The Reckoning, Rafa, and Reggae Girlz, recorded live in New York. I'm Thom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. Last weekend, we held our documentary spotlight event in New York City. On our last episode, we heard 4 of those conversations. Now we complete our coverage with the final 3. Documentary Spotlight is a co-presentation with The Ankler. We begin with Sean Combs' The Reckoning. The 4-part series is directed by Alexandria Stapleton and produced by Curtis Jackson, a.k.a. 50 Cent. They explore how Combs rose in the world of hip-hop, creating a trail of toxic relationships that ultimately sent him to prison, with numerous cases still pending against him. I first spoke to Alexandria last December, soon after the series was released. You can hear that conversation on episode 233. Now, 6 months later, I was eager to hear her perspective with more distance. Let's go to our talk at New York's Roxy Theater. So, Alexandria, you've made films about Roger Corman, about Reggie Jackson, your new film this year about Brittany Griner, all people who have really admirable qualities. And I would have to think that waking up each day, you got to feel good that you're going to plunge into that life. This is a very different beast of a project, and 4 parts. You are digging up a lot of new stuff. You're interviewing people about the most traumatic times of their life. What was that like for you to kind of, get yourself mentally into this game?
Well, it was extremely challenging. It was challenging because I didn't know where the story was going to end up. I started making this the day that Cassie dropped her lawsuit. So that was very early on. I had no idea that he was going to be indicted.
A trial that we now have
Right.
watched that hadn't yet to take place.
Right. But I knew that I wanted to look underneath the hood and to really investigate sort of is there room or acceptance within, the hip hop community for a Me Too conversation and a reckoning of sorts. And so that's where the journey started. And then once I got into it, it was wild. I mean, there were other docs and other projects going on at the same time with, I think a lot of people were fixated on the salacious details. And for me, I wanted to take my time and to really concentrate on the ecosystem, the world that Sean created to even get to a point where you could have some of these crazy things happen. And then obviously, connecting with victims, connecting with people, not just victims, but also people that really respect him and old childhood friends, and really working towards gaining access and trust. And that was I was on call 24/7. It was over a year of just being available, being at any time. I was on the phone many nights until 3:00 in the morning, talking. And I realized that so many of these people that gave their voice to the film, no one ever talked to them, and no one ever believed them. They were kind of discarded, many of them. And so it was just this energy of them wanting to share their story for the first time.
So you and I spoke in December, freshly after the project had come out, and we talked about one of the assets you have in this project is 50 Cent, Curtis Jackson, as a producer. He's someone who has a cachet and respect inside the world of hip-hop communities that could foster connections that that other outside reporters wouldn't necessarily have. Can you give an example of ways in which he was able to do that?
Yeah, I mean, 50's name was a big, giant name for people to feel like the project was going to be credible in many ways. I mean, you have to kind of like go back in time and remember that there was a lot of fear, with people. People were afraid not only for their reputations, but sometimes for their safety. And so I think having a project with 50 as the EP, it provided somewhat, like at the very least, they knew that I wasn't going to film them or record conversations and give them to Sean's camp. I mean, that's the level that we were sort of operating at moments. And so, 50 also talked to people on the phone and really, made it very clear, like, this is a film, this is your story. Whatever you want to tell us, the truth of in your POV and your experience is what we're after. And so people felt increasingly more encouraged to come forward. And then people would sort of talk to other people. They also knew that we were it was really important to me to not share anyone's identity, like while I was making the film, unless they wanted that to be known. So until the film came out, like a lot of people didn't even know who else was going to be in the film, which was very challenging because most people want to know who's going to be in it before they feel comfortable. But yeah, it was sort of a perfect storm, and I think that we kind of gained a reputation of like being a serious project. My interviews are very, very, very long, and so I think that also made people feel comfortable that I wasn't after just like these, two sound bites from them, just to exploit them again. But it was about tell me the good, the bad, and the ugly of like what you went through, because I wanted people to understand, an audience to understand the backstory of why these people got involved with Sean. I think it's very easy to judge people, especially when in matters of sexual assault stories. And I felt that this film really needed to paint a picture of what happened before, the alleged crimes.
And I think that's something the film does so well and is able to do in 4 parts, is to bring context to help us understand his rise and what he meant to the kind of power he held over people. I want to hear more about that process of interviewing people who are describing, some of the worst points in their life, and what you did to prepare yourself for that. We'll start there.
Well, my preparation was sort of being led by the person that I was in conversation with. I spent a lot of time on the phone, and sometimes, meeting people in person, exploring, where they wanted to go, where they didn't want to go. It's not my job to force people to, give me more and more, details. I wanted them to feel extremely comfortable. It was sort of a 360 preparation though too, because I also, feel a great deal of responsibility for the people filming, the people on set. And so we had, we would have talks about the subject matter before we got started with shooting. Everyone's identity was confidential until that day, when people could actually see who we were in conversation with. And we had, a 24-hour hotline for people who needed to call to speak with a therapist, because some of this stuff is really, really, really heavy. And for the victims, I keep my sets very quiet, very, very calm. We try to get all the frenetic energy out of the environment before, like when they're en route to coming to us, because I want to keep the crew calm and just to kind of create a cocoon for people. And then, I also make everyone leave, except for the DP and sound, but usually I hide sound and tuck them in a corner. So it's really just myself and my cinematographer that are in there with the person that's speaking. And I think that worked really well because the interviews sort of turned into conversations, and it didn't feel like they were on trial. And some of, like Capricorn Clark, there were a few people that, Capricorn Clark actually was on trial. And for her, it was really important to get her to kind of like shed that skin, because I think she went through a sort of a traumatic
Well,
experience.
she's
on
just for
trial.
context here. Correct me if I'm wrong, but she's someone who didn't really want to be speaking. She wasn't saying, "I want to go out and tell my story to a documentary crew." She says, if I remember correctly, something to the effect like, "I was ready to like go to my grave with these stories," but it was because she got subpoenaed in a court case that she was brought to public light.
Correct.
And she has some harrowing stories about having worked for Sean Combs. Describe what you think her, motivations were coming to you.
I think that once you go through such a high octane situation of that trial, I mean, the whole world was tuning in. And I think that she felt like her whole story wasn't out there. I think she felt like, especially depending on how you look at it, the government was not really successful in the charges and getting, those charges across the finish line. And so you have all these people that, really stood up to him and took the witness stand to share with the world what happened. And that will live on forever and ever and ever. And I think for Capricorn Clark, she felt a little slighted that she wasn't able to express like the whole story. And, then there were a lot of people that started attacking her, feeling, saying that they didn't find her story credible and that she was lying. And I think that we don't tend to examine what people go through on the other side of like living with that. And so I think her motivation for participating in this film was an opportunity to go, wait a minute, like, let me unfiltered kind of tell you my story, without being on the stand. And I think that was very freeing, for her.
So you and I spoke in December when the series was just a couple weeks out in the world. Now here we are 6 months later. What has that time meant for people who are in the film, for how you see the film going out into the world and helping to inform a narrative? What have been the most meaningful things to you?
Well, as far as the story of Sean Combs and the story, the bigger story of the macro story of the ecosystem that he was working in and the world that he was working in, I think there's a bigger story to tell. And so I'm happy that people are talking about this project, but I hope it can, I think that this is...
You mean a bigger story? Still, yeah, I mean, you covered a lot of ground in 4 parts.
I think
but
it's
in some
tip
ways,
of the iceberg.
Right.
The tip of the iceberg. And I think it's the tip of the iceberg, not only just about certain things about Sean, but I think, I'm, as a documentarian, like one mantra that I always have is like, follow the money. Who was allowing and enabling the behavior to take place? And I think those are bigger conversations that I hope, continue to be of interest to the public, so that we can, come together to try to stop this type of behavior from happening. I think that, where we are now, I feel it's interesting as a doc filmmaker. You work so hard and the craft is so important. And I had an incredible team of producers and editors and archival research teams, and we worked so incredibly hard all the way up until like 6 hours before the back half of the show, or the show was on air, to get this out there. But it's sort of like a paradox, because it's celebrating the craft of filmmaking, but yet it's such dark material, and it's really harrowing, to feel proud about that. It's like the weird word. So I've kind of had my own sort of inner monologue about that and how to digest that, while being proud of the craft of it. And I just hope that the conversation keeps happening. I think in this country right now, we have similar actors, everyone like Epstein to others. And I really hope that this goes in the canon of those types of projects of us as a public understanding that we have to, the laws in this country really need to be re-examined of how we treat victims of sexual assault, first and foremost. But our culture. Like, how do we take these stories? How do we find the credibility in them and take victims seriously and hold people accountable, hold famous people accountable, hold rich people accountable, hold billionaires, politicians accountable? And I think that that's a kind of a reckoning that we're having as a greater community right now. And I hope that this film helps to further that conversation.
I mean, when you talk about so many other stories to be told there, do you feel like you've done your part and you'll let other people tell those stories, or do you feel like there's more for you to tell?
I definitely would not shy. Like, I don't know if there's like a part 2 of The Reckoning that I'm going to sign up for. I would definitely. I mean, there's so much that didn't make this 4-hour experience, and so under the right circumstances, I would pick it back up again. There's a lot more that's coming down the pipeline. We have, episode 2 of this series is really about Sean and Biggie and Tupac and the murder of both of them. And we have a trial, coming up later this year, Keefe D. And so I'm very curious to see what's going to come out of that. So there's other storylines that I think I'm very interested in pursuing. But I don't want to be a part of a gratuitous bandwagon, of just ambulance chasing stuff for the sake of attention.
I mean, you said you began this project with a question in your mind, is there a way for a deeper reckoning over Me Too stories in the hip hop community? Where do you feel like that question has come in the years that you've been making this?
I still think that we have a ways to go. I think that there's the Me Too movement happened, but I think there's a lot of worlds that it didn't really touch. Hip hop maybe being one of them. The art world. I mean, there's like lots of different niche communities that sort of were able to escape the accountability. A lot of people with a lot of influence and power and money. And so I think that I encourage men and women of all ages and from different backgrounds to try to encourage and propel conversations like this forward.
What are the things that you learned on this project that you can carry forward to your next projects?
Oh man, that's like such a hard question because I learned so much. I think I learned, a lot. Gosh, I learned a lot. I think that the biggest thing my biggest takeaway, I would say, more than maybe what I learned, was how much power we have as people, as civilians in a community, as just members of communities. I think, this is the story of Sean Combs, but again, it's also sort of like a mirror up to us as a public and our adoration for celebrity and for fame and power and money and all of those things. And I think that I realized, I think that I was really interested in really related to the audience in a way, or I wanted to relate to the public, that I'm a member of the public and I'm an audience member, I'm a civilian, I'm a member of community. And, I think that at times I was asking myself, like, wow, like, I grew up, I spent my teens and early 20s coming up in the New York streets, and like this was my world too. It was like working and would hear rumors and how we all just let that kind of chatter happen and no one really does anything about it. And so I think, now being in my mid 40s, I feel like a sense of responsibility to hold people accountable, and the work that I do and the craft that I hold.
I mean, as I finish this up, I want to dig into that a little bit more, because I think one of the things that comes out in the film is, people who suffered under Sean Combs and felt like they didn't have any support system. I mean, you talk to people who had experiences going back 30 years that if they had been listened to more, could have sounded an alarm. So, like in regards to what you're saying about, each of us kind of trying to use our voice more. How do you think about that in regards to there's a whole system that discourages you from using your voice?
Well, it's listening, but it's also sort of understanding. And again, with the film, with Sean is sort of like an antagonistic sort of protagonist. I thought it was also really important to show how he did it, some of his methods. And I think that these are methods that, I think a lot of narcissists use, dividing and conquering, isolating people, making people feel like that you were the only way that they can survive. And in many ways, that's actually true. In many of these stories, like Little Rod and Kirk Burroughs, these were men that felt like their own. Sean was an opportunity for them, and so I think that it's important to listen to victims, but it's also important to sort of study what abusers do and the patterns of abusers, so that you can start to understand how. Isolation is a big tool that I think Sean used, and I think that was very prevalent in a lot of these stories. People feeling so absolutely alone, and so if you understand a little bit of what the attack is like, then perhaps you can be of service, in a tiny way, to someone that you might come across.
I think your film does do this in the way that sometimes we watch films about cults and we see that's how they gain control. Let me be mindful of that as I walk through the world and try to avoid that. And I think your film does that really well. That was Alexandria Stapleton talking about her 4-part series, Sean Combs: The Reckoning, now playing on Netflix. Our next 2 projects connect to the world of sports. It was just a couple weeks ago when Netflix released the revealing 4-part series, Rafa, about the Spanish tennis champion Rafael Nadal. The filmmaker is Heinzerling, who first made a name for himself with the Oscar-nominated documentary Cutie and the Boxer, set in the art world. Here's my conversation with Zach. So, Zach, before making this project, what did Rafa as a tennis player, as an icon, mean to you?
Not much. I think a lot of them. I pay attention to the sports world, but never really worked on anything in sports.
You made Cutie and the Boxer. You made a film with Paul McCartney. You've worked with Beyonce. Yeah, nothing that I saw on your resume suggested sports.
And I think even for American sports fans, Rafa has always felt like an enigma. He's very private. He lives in Mallorca, an island off the coast of Spain, speaks Mallorquin, which is a dialect of Catalan, and has always sort of, identified as shy. Unlike Roger and Novak, who've become these kind of global celebrities, Rafa's harder to know. So I didn't know much. It was basically 2 weeks before he was going to start the 2024 season, which he had said could be his last. And they just decided to make something. At the time, it may have been a film. It was maybe a series. So
someone was bringing this idea to you?
Yeah. Rafa had basically said no to any kind of documentary or wide scope book for his entire career, and something about it being the end. I guess his team felt like in order to understand him, you needed to actually see him play as opposed to hear him talk. So this was that opportunity.
Well, it's interesting when you say his team, and I think that's probably not unusual for someone of that stature to, make career decisions as a team. Would it be accurate to say that there were other people who were encouraging him to do this more than he was initiating himself?
Very accurate. I don't think Rafa ever wanted to do it. And I still feel like to this day, he can't actually say whether he likes it or not. He has a hard time sort of seeing himself and self sort of analyzing. And I feel like he does, though, listen, and he's had the same team for basically 20, 25 years. So, he sort of trusted that, okay, well, if they think this is a good idea and we have the right partner and there's a sort of, platform in which potentially my, this sort of story legend can be portrayed, then let's go for it. And when he decided to do it, he went all in.
Did you feel a need to establish your own personal rapport with him, and how did that happen?
Yeah, it was strange. It's I've never had this in a directing job, but basically they said this is a trial. So I flew to Australia where he was playing his first tournament, and they were like, if he likes you, then maybe we'll continue. And I remember just sitting in the van next to him, and he looked around, and our first exchange was he was looking for his coach, and I was sitting in his coach's seat. And much like, if you know anything about Rafa, he has these routines. Some people say it's OCD. For him, it's this control mechanism. He has this routine before every serve. He's obsessed, meticulous with the way he places his water bottle. So anyway, I had disrupted what was likely a 20-year tradition of a seating arrangement in the van, and immediately wanted to crawl out of my skin. But
how's your Mallorcan?
I speak Spanish, so that is helpful.
A bridge.
But in Australia, he gets injured sort of right away, and there was something about me being present for that sort of created a bit of a bond emotionally. I witnessed him in a very vulnerable state, and a lot of the times I would be filming because we would be in a car or something small, and I also think he liked that I could film myself because he basically just doesn't want to disappoint or upset other people is his primary thing. So the fact that I only took one seat in the van as opposed to a sound guy, etc., was partly why I got the job too, I think. But yeah, I don't know. There was following him through a season is much easier to, get to know somebody when you're not having to stop them and ask them questions and sort of impose. It was observational for the first, 5 or 6 months. And so in that way, we're traveling with the team. My team's hanging out with his team. We're going to dinner. We're at hotels, etc. And that in that way, and his family is extremely. They had never been on camera, right? He's a famous tennis star, so he's used to it. But his mom, dad, sister, and wife, this was all their kind of first exposure to this. So as far as gaining trust, that took a lot of time, but eventually. So
in facing this kind of daunting figure, what was your driver for you're giving up a year to follow him and more to complete a project? You start out by saying that sports have never been a centerpiece of your career. So what was the thing propelling you?
I think he has this infectiousness. I don't know if any of you've seen the series, but there's this sort of gentle, bordering on a kind of insecurity, but it's really sort of just a softness that is, I say, infectious. It makes you root for him. He's sort of the eternal underdog. You had Federer, who kind of walks on water, and then you have Rafa, who's this, warrior battling, every last point. And even when he was number one, he sort of would place himself lower, and say that who so and so who was playing, who's maybe like 200 in the world, had a good chance of winning. Always very self-deprecating, modest, but he draws you in, and I feel like me and my and producers and everyone on the team, we were just rooting for him. I mean, he was battling injuries. He was trying to sort of make a comeback, and every match we would be so geared up for this like massive win, and we'd have 4 or 5 cameras, and then he kept losing, and it was like heartbreak after heartbreak. And it went from a story about a comeback to a story of why won't this guy stop, which then sort of led us to his past. So the question of when is he going to stop kept me going, and then the question of why doesn't he stop is sort of responsible for the past interstitial, the archival material.
And so the way you just described it there, let me understand if I get it correctly. You embarked to follow him on this last season. Were you not thinking so much that it was going to be dives into the past along the way that came organically?
It definitely came organically. I mean, there was, it was like maybe it was going to be a feature. If he had made some run, and won another French Open, that in and of itself could have been this kind of, Rocky-esque feature. But, it became clear that the heart of the story was going to be in the past. What motivates this guy? Who is he, right? Like beyond this, like warrior / insecure, fighter. What else is there?
I want to ask about your visual approach, because it's very deliberate. I mean, of course, you've got the layers of archival footage, but when you're in a room with Rafa, it's not you work a lot with close-ups. There's a palette there, and I want to understand how you developed that and thought about that.
Yeah, well, I would give most of the credit to Adam Ewell, who's the DP on the project. But I think that there's again, like his family, even if he weren't a tennis player, they live in this small village, an island on an island, right on the coast. He like goes fishing. His dad lives next door. His uncle lives there. His sister there. It's kind of an amazing, loving, warm atmosphere. And you kind of just want to sit in the living room. I feel like as far as the interviews, it was like, how do we sort of just be in this, comfortable space with whoever it is. I never had them sitting sort of in front of a kind of stage feeling. It was always, I never wanted to move the furniture so that it would kind of be like, the subject here and a perfect background. We actually kept the furniture where they are, so the couch is actually next to the wall, and it just feels like they're just sitting in their living room, because they are. And I don't know, there's something to that. It just makes it less, like I think the wife in particular, more than what she says, it's her face that's communicating so much. There's an innocence, because it's and a sort of newness for the experience to her, but then I don't know. There's just this like sweet and incredibly honest, feeling that you get from being close to her, sitting on a sofa in their living room. That is, for me, more impactful than necessarily everything she's saying.
What were the things that you were learning on this film? And I asked that question because you've got a decade and a half or more of experience behind you now, and enough experience to feel like you know what you're doing. But I think on every film, one of the great and frustrating things about making films is that there's always like something new to figure out. And what was it on this film?
Yeah, I love films that challenge you to, do something different in the form, which is what's nice about documentary, is that there is no form. It's sort of, there's so many ways that you can push and make something, hyper realistic or more cinematic, or are you going for something that's sort of meta, that's sort of commenting on the experience of making a documentary? We've seen a lot of great examples of that recently. The challenge in this for me was, usually you would have, something that's like a Beckham, that's like 90% archival or 95, and then you have these little vignettes, slice of life, that give you like an impression of what they're like. Or the opposite, which would be like a follow doc, a verite doc, where it would be 95%, following them, and then maybe you would flash back and see some photos of their childhood. I was trying to do essentially two storylines, but both would have not necessarily equal, but almost equal sort of strength or importance in this hybrid. And that was hard because you're basically taking this season and what are the moments in the past that are going to resonate with something that we're seeing in the present? What's the juxtaposition between him and when he's young and him when he's old doing? Are they different when they're actually quite similar? It's actually when it's the most interesting, because you're realizing that this person, 20 years later, without having to say it through interview, is sort of stuck in the same, pattern of trying to appease his uncle, which I think is basically what's responsible for his victories and his perseverance, is a fear of not disappointing his uncle. But again, it's not something, he's going to say, or the uncle's going to say. And it felt like by the end of his career, what you needed, there are other documentaries that have done this sort of like the retirement thing, but I feel like you need the weight of, the past to make you actually emotionally feel anything when somebody is retiring. It's like somebody saying goodbye, and they're crying, but am I, empathizing with that, or do I understand why this is so important? So kind of maintaining those emotional arcs was the most challenging thing, mostly from an editorial, and I give most of the credit there to the editors, Drew Blattman specifically, but it's I'm not sure I would choose to do that again, and if I had to choose.
That was Zach Heinzerling talking about his 4-part series, Rafa, now playing on Netflix. Our final project comes from Red Bull Studios and feels appropriate with World Cup fever upon us. The film is Reggae Girlz, about the Jamaican women's football team that went to the 2023 World Cup tournament. The filmmakers, Charmaine Obaid-Chinoy and Trish Dalton, follow the team on this journey and witness the dramatic gap of support between men and women athletes. The directors worked closely with their Jamaican executive producer, Cedella Marley. The film premiered last November at Doc NYC and will be released later this year. Here's my conversation with director Trish Dalton. So, Trish, how did you and your directing partner, Charmaine, get focused on the story of Jamaica's women's team?
It was 2020 during COVID, and the players had the team, Reggae Girlz, which is the Jamaican women's football team, had been in 2019 World Cup, and it was the first time ever that a women's football team from Caribbean had gotten in. It was the first Caribbean team. So Laura called me. She was a producer in the UK, and Charmine and I, because we had made Student Athlete, which was about athletes' rights, and both of us had made films about women's rights, and we thought it sounded like a good story to potentially follow them. And she partnered with Astronaut Films. She's UK-based production company, and we put together the story, the deck, and got to know the girls because it was COVID over Zoom. And because even though we have this history of caring about women's rights and athletes' rights, it was important to meet the players because we didn't know, especially then, if they would get into another World Cup. And we thought it would be interesting to see if they would, but I especially felt like we needed to make sure that the players were interesting to carry a story. And as soon as I met them over Zoom, I was like, these are amazing women and they have amazing stories. And we decided to focus on the Jamaican-born players at that time because they had so much riding on this, and just the strength and their personal stories were already so evocative so we started pitching, and Cedella Marley came on as an executive producer. She was also an ambassador for the team, so she is in the story. She's a big part of the reason that they were able to play at all.
So Cedella Marley, for context, is the daughter of Bob Marley, a major figure in Jamaica. One of the themes of the film is the degree to which the women's team is grossly underfunded compared to men's sports in Jamaica, but of course that is true in many places of the world. And Cedella Marley kind of made it her mission to do whatever she could to try to compensate.
Yeah, we were lucky in that we just were holding the microphone up for these players on their journey, and Cedella, as an EP and as someone featured in the film, was super important for me to know that we were sharing the stories in the right way, that we understood the culture, that we understood them, and she helped us to earn their trust as well because they trusted her. And I think it was really important to be close with her while we were telling the story, and to show the story became a lot of the story of how women help women, that they couldn't have got there without her help.
Film starts out with a kind of tried and true concept, like this team has a goal, which is to go back to the World Cup. You're going to follow that journey. I'm sure that you kind of understood some of the headwinds against them when you started. But then as you went along, what were the other things that revealed themselves to you as that maybe you hadn't seen coming from the beginning?
Well, yeah, we didn't realize. I mean, we knew, obviously, you're coming from a country without many resources. You're coming from a lot of the struggles that a lot of, I think, smaller countries have going against bigger countries are resources. So we knew that was going to be there. And then coupled with that, we also know that, or I guess I didn't realize until we were filming how deep of a level of misogyny still exists in the culture. And at the same time, I think as a woman making the film, I've had similar experiences where you feel like shut down because you're women and not treated. I think this came up when we were talking about Little Affair, but like where you feel like, okay, the way Sarah McLachlan was shut down, I think this is similar to how these players are, that they just didn't get the notoriety. I mean, it's in the film, but it was kind of shocking that they were doing so well. They got when we started filming. So what happened is Red Bull Studios came on and gave us funding to start filming when they qualified for the second World Cup, which was in 2022, the end of 2022. So we started filming then and followed them through to the World Cup. And we didn't know what that journey was going to look like, and it was ended up being an amazing story because they kept overcoming hurdle after hurdle, and with the help of Cedella, but really from their own stamina and strength, I would say.
I mean, I think there's a fallback trope to sports documentaries, which is an expectation you're following the team to go all the way. And in following this team, I don't think you had that expectation. And so, kind of as a storyteller, how were you thinking about how to manage this, knowing that audiences come with a certain, even if they don't intend to, it's a built-in bias?
Yeah. Well, there was the risk that we didn't know what was going to happen whether they would, we knew they got into the World Cup. We didn't know what was going to happen when they got there and how the story was going to go. And it became, like, to your point, an extra underdog story, because even though they got in, they had all these things holding them back from actually getting there, which made the story better. It also made the story better that once they got there, they did really well. But I think we believed, just having met the players, that following them no matter what was going to be interesting. So I think I can't say what would have happened if it had gone otherwise, and it really was a matter, like you said, it was in the trope, but we were just rolling on what was happening. And some of the drama that ensued was just real. That was all.
I mean, what you're doing is, in an observational context this way, happens less and less in documentary films. I mean, there's so many films that are built out of archival footage and built out of their interview-driven films, and those can be great films. No knock against them, but extracting your storytelling from being there in the moment, having your camera in the room, coming back, time and time again over the course of time is a different discipline of filmmaking. And I wonder if you can, reflect on what it took to do that in the case of this film, and what you think you got out of being present for so long.
Yeah, well, we were really grateful that Red Bull Studios took a risk and gave us the funding, because we were filming in Jamaica, Europe, Australia. We needed money to travel. We worked with a small crew, but we really needed their support. We were really grateful that they believed in us and in the story. And I think what was driving Charmaine and I was just, we both believe that the more that you can hear these stories about women, especially women athletes, the more that people will be interested and supportive of them. And both of us have been athletes growing up and got a lot out of being athletes, and we believe that women should be allowed to be athletes and should be able to play, and that the more, I think we were inspired to get right in there and meet them. As I was mentioning to you earlier, like my nephew, when he was 4, he lives in Canada, would talk about hockey, and he would talk about everything in the players' lives. And I thought, I never had that. And I think a lot of women still, we don't know all the personal things in a lot of female or women athletes' lives. And so I felt like if we could get in there and really show the lives of these women, then audience members could get to know them and then want to support them and want to watch them. And that's going to only help them to be able to play. And that's going to help sponsors be able to sponsor and all of that. So our drive, to answer your question of like being able to just hang around and watch and wait, and it was 6 years or however long it took us to make it, I think that was what was driving us, that we believe that we just stayed with them, that their stories were going to take us somewhere.
I mean, I've observed in my job at the Toronto Film Festival, where I've shown films about women's sports, I think a film called Copa 71 or Maya and the Wave, films that in a festival audience had people on their feet cheering, crying, asking when can we watch this, and then watching those films have very difficult journeys into the distribution world, which is this ironic, if that's the word, parallel to what we're often seeing on the screen is women athletes being undervalued. And when stories about women athletes are brought to the marketplace, we often see them undervalued as well. And I know your film has been making the festival rounds. You're still figuring out your distribution pathway, but how have you experienced that?
Yeah, we're having a similar experience. Like I said, we're very grateful to Red Bull for believing in the story and getting us to the finish line. And they've done it with other stories about female women athletes. And I think our experience is sort of similar to what happened on the screen, because for us, getting support, we've got great support from festivals, and we've just got an audience support actually last week. But we're still looking for distribution.
You must have known when you took on this project that it would be a long journey. Maybe they all seem to go a little bit longer than we think they will from the get-go. But what are the things that you took away from this journey?
I think, what was really encouraging about it was the players themselves. I think that this film speaks to that, but I think their strength and their ability to carry on, and these are pretty young women, they're in their early 20s, maybe mid to late 20s, and through every single thing that happened to them, they just kept believing and kept going. And I even feel emotional talking about it, because they had so much riding and so many things they could walk away from, and they had it so hard. And I think that keeps us going too, to keep telling these stories, because to me they are inspiring, and I do really feel like I want them to feel supported, and I want that their voices get out there and their stories get told.
I mean, you described the legendary athlete Marta, who speaks about these stories missing from her life when she was growing up. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, there's this great moment that we were able to put into the film. The Jamaica team plays the Brazilian team, and Marta, who's arguably the biggest women's football player, tears up because she's about to retire, and she says how in her whole career she never had anyone to look up to, and that nobody had those stories. So there's this amazing moment, not to give away the film, but in the film where Jamaica plays Brazil, and Bunny Shaw, who's the biggest player on the Jamaican team, goes up to Marta, and they have this hug at the end of the game where, I don't know if I should say what happens for everybody who hasn't seen it, but normally when you have somebody knock another team out, you wouldn't think they would hug. But they hug, and there's a really emotional, teary moment, and Marta basically says that she just thinks they say they think the world of each other. And I don't think I'm emotional thinking about it, but that's what it is. It's keep holding each other up.
How do you see this? This is a film about football. It's a film about Jamaica's team. But the way you talk about it, there's a more universal themes in this, and I wonder if you can reflect on those.
Yeah, I mean, I think to that same point, the universal theme of women helping women, and I think football and women's sports, but obviously with basketball and football, I think we're about to see, I feel like there's a tipping point that's coming, and the more attention, I think next year Women's World Cup is going to be really big. I think it's going to be in Brazil. I think more people can watch it. When it was in Australia, the time change affected it. So I think that there's going to be a tipping point, and I'd like for this film to come out now so that people can tune in and get excited about the Women's World Cup, and for more people to watch women's football.
That was Trish Dalton, the director of Reggae Girlz, produced by Red Bull Studios and coming later this year. I want to thank all our guests for speaking with me. Documentary Spotlight is co-presented by The Ankler. You can follow their work at theankler.com. Thanks to our partners on this event, Apple TV, Disney, Netflix, Prime Video, and Red Bull Studios. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Nordenswan, Doc Voices editor Bella Racklin, and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Rafaela Nehausen. I'm Thom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and visit our website at purenonfiction.net.